Hey guys, I am here to talk about my new GTX 1080 that you can see inside my case because I got a fancy new windowed panel here and some LED lights that only do white because, you know what, I'm okay with old school. But this isn't going to be a full-on GTX 1080 review. That has been done back and forth and up and down, and if you need reviews, there are places better than me that you can go to get them. So what I'm going to talk about mainly is if my computer or if your computer will bottleneck a GeForce GTX 1080. As you guys know, I have the EVGA 1080 with the ACX cooler. It's a completely reference board, so stock clocks, the stock, I think, 1797 megahertz boost speed, although on its own it went to about 1845. And of course the 10 gigahertz GDDR5X memory. Now, let me tell you about the overclocks first. On the GPU, I went up 175 megahertz, and I've actually been able to go a lot higher. At one point, I had it up to 225, and the GPU clock was exceeding 2100 megahertz regularly, and it was pretty awesome. I was like, yay, I beat the 2.1 gigahertz barrier. However, it did not seem fully stable at that point. As for the memory, I seem to be one of few having a rare circumstance where I can barely overclock it. If I push the memory past 100 megahertz over at any time, it starts artifacting almost immediately. So unfortunately, I couldn't go very far with the memory. And I backed the GPU overclock down to 175 just because even when I had it to like 195, in situations where it wasn't overclocked, for instance, I'd be watching a YouTube video and there'd be blocky artifacts appearing. So even though the GPU was not pushing itself, I was having problems, and turning down the offset seemed to fix these. Now, I have increased the power limit and the temperature target, and I've also applied a custom fan profile. The fan maxes out at about 2200 RPMs on very demanding games, and it gets to about, at worst, 78 degrees. Now, when comparing this card to my old 1070, it obviously is faster in pretty much all cases. I have noticed a few instances here and there where it might be very close, and even in these instances, it just seems like the application using the GPU isn't fully 100% doing so. So it's not that the GPU is slower, I never expected that, it's just not fully utilizing it. The ACX cooler is absolutely way quieter during normal operation than the blower cooler on the 1070 was. But if you turn that cooler up to 80 or 100%, you hear it, and I think it gets just as loud, if not louder. However, there's not a real world use situation where you're going to have it going that fast. Even with my increased fan curve, it gets to maybe 70 at the highest. And I have it set to ramp up if that GPU gets really hot. And with EVGA's new fan curves to fix the thermal issues with the VRMs, it gets to maybe 70% as well. So it's still pretty cool. However, there is unfortunately one circumstance in which the card is much louder than the 1070, and that is coil whine. It's weird coil whine because it's very intermittent. It only happens sometimes and not consistently. I don't know too much about coil whine because I've never had to deal with it, thankfully. But for instance, I could be in a game at 100 frames a second and I'll hear it, but then it'll stop, even though the frame rate hasn't changed. Anyway, I'd like to show you guys some audio samples of what the fans sound like and what the coil whine sounds like. So here you go. Let's get to some gameplay. What I'm going to do is show you instances where the GPU might be bottlenecked and where it definitely is not, so that you can be confident in your choice. Alright, so we are back with Doom. I'm going to show you the advanced settings. I'm actually using the Vulkan API, and that is because it's playing nicely with G-Sync right now, and it's showing me the actual frame rate the monitor is showing. But you can't use overlays, so what I've done is on the bottom left you will see from my desktop the CPU use and GPU use to drive home the point. Obviously this won't be an apples to apples comparison with the GeForce 1070 review, but that's not the point of this video. Obviously the 1080 is going to be faster. So yeah, as we open the door and get in here, you'll see frame rates are high. 90s, 80s, 100s. That's no big deal, but as you can see, the GPU use is standing at about 96%. CPU is up there, but you have to also remember that I am recording right now, using software recording to get the footage for that CPU and GPU meter. So as you can see, no bottlenecking is occurring right now whatsoever, none to speak of, and that's a good thing. So this Doom is a great example of one game that you don't need a super high-end CPU to bottleneck. Now, you can see my CPU is working fairly hard, so, I mean, it could just be that I'm on the threshold of what is acceptable without bottlenecking, but I think there's still some room to play there. Again, you have to keep in mind that I am recording using software encoding, so that's all on the CPU. But as you can see, the performance is fantastic, especially with the Vulkan API. On OpenGL, it didn't use the GPU 100% like Vulkan tends to. But as you can see, GPU is being fully utilized here. We're sitting at 95, 96%, and we're running at 120, 130 frames a second, so there is no bottleneck to speak of. Hey, buddy, get wrecked. Get wrecked. Oh, you're wrecked. So, first example here, don't need an i7 to run a 1080. Alright, so we're back with The Witcher 3. For reasons unknown, Riva Tuner's fighting with me, and now the statistics on the GPU and CPU usage are on the top left. But, everything is the same as it was before. No hair works, nothing like that. Everything on high except for depth of field, because screw depth of field. Anyway, right off the bat, you can see my GPU usage is at 99%, so this is actually great. It's using the GPU fully. And if you remember on the 1070, I was getting frame rates in the 60s and 50s. So you can see here, substantial improvement. Not a question at all about that. But this is actually a great game to get into the topic of CPU bottlenecking, because as you can see right now, there is no bottleneck occurring at all. My CPUs are working pretty hard at about 75 to 85%, but the GPU is being fully utilized to render this game. But, however, there are circumstances where that will not apply. But, as you can see from this instance, having a slower CPU, I mean, i5 isn't exactly slow in my opinion, but it's not removing any of the benefits that you would have by having a 1080. No, you don't, bitch. Where's my... Alright, whatever. There it is. Alright. But I'm going to show you guys an instance of where bottlenecking will occur and why exactly it will occur. Because as you can see here, the frame rate is excellent. Big improvement over the 1070. We're getting in the 70s and 80s consistently. The GPU is being fully used, and it's just a beautiful experience. Like, for all of the quality settings maxed except for Hairworks, which no big deal, and depth of field, which probably wouldn't add that much anyway. But I'm going to get to the map here. Where is the nearest signpost? Right there. So let me set... half our way, right over there. But yeah, you guys can see, buttery smooth. Now, is the experience a whole lot better than the 1070? I mean, objectively, it's about the same. 80 frames per second definitely feels better than 59, 60 did, but in a game where... My controller's acting funny. Where you're using a controller anyway, it's not that big a deal. But we're going to go to... Novigrad. Where are you? Where are you? Wait, did I... There we go. I'm going to show you guys bottlenecking. Now, the point of this is to show you that it's not the GPU that's bottlenecking the CPU. In fact, it's the game that's bottlenecking the CPU, which in turn is preventing the GPU from working at its best. Now, you can see GPU usage 71, 79. All of my cores are maxed out, and that is because here in Novigrad there is just a ton of NPC activity. NPCs everywhere doing all sorts of crap. And you can see the frames have dropped 30, 40, like it's having a hard time. And yes, there is a bottleneck occurring here, but the CPU is only causing it because of all the crap that's going on in the game. The GPU has nothing to do with it. A slower GPU would be more heavily utilized only because it would be having a harder time keeping up anyway. So yes, this is a bottleneck, and it is happening here. If I had a octa-core processor or hyper-threading, this would be substantially less apparent. I mean, it's a bit jarring because the frame rates keep jumping and falling, but it's actually still a little bit better than on the 1070. In town on the 1070, I'd be getting 40 to 50 frames a second. It's still not the most pleasant experience, but you can see my CPUs are all pegged with what's going on, and the GPU is just resting at 80 to 75% utilized. So there's an example of a bottleneck, but as you saw in the outdoor part, there's definitely benefit to be had with a faster graphics card, even if you only have an i5. But now we will move on to the next game. Alright guys, Killing Floor 2. Reaver Tuner decided that, once again, that maybe the statistics should be where I wanted them to be on the bottom left, so that's where they are. Frame rate on the top right. Playing Killing Floor 2, I just need to turn on all of the options, including real-time reflections. I had that off because I actually don't really care for it a lot of the time. But as you can see, everything else is turned up all the way. Gibbs and Fluids on, and yeah, we're doing the same map, same perk as before, Demolitions, but they changed the damn starting locations, which sucks because I wanted. Oh, that's actually worked out for me. All right, beautiful. So you guys can see 140, 130 frames a second. GPU usage is in the 90s. CPU usage is in the mid-60s. So this is another game that is heavy on GPU use that the CPU is not bottlenecking, as you can see plainly. Frame rates are clearly higher than they were before. I mean, the Gibbs do bring it down, as was the case before, but it doesn't seem to be as heavily so as last time. Oh, I fucked that up again. There we go. So yeah, we're getting in the 60s, 70s, and that's with all of that gore on the screen. Who else wants some? Yeah, cannot complain about this performance, but as you can see, GPU use still stays at or near 100%, so it is not being bottlenecked at all here. Alright, we learned our lesson about fatty last time, so let's just... There you go. You don't need the head. You never used it anyway. And eggs, you tried that shit last time. So yeah, 70s, 80s, before it would get into the 50s, 60s, so it handles the flex a little bit better than before. I have to say the performance in Killing Floor 2 has increased. Now, with NVIDIA Flex, you can really, really tank the frame rate. I mean, if there's a bunch of Zeds on the screen and you're using something that gives all the things, I've gotten it down to 24 frames a second, even with the 1080. That's just how NVIDIA Flex is going to work. But you can see, during normal use, it's fantastic. High frame rates, can't complain at all about this performance. But, again, no CPU bottlenecks in this instance, Kent, not instant. Where the hell did I even come from? Yeah, I feel like my point is getting proven, but there's one more example I'd like to show you of how there is a CPU bottleneck, but you can do things to still extract performance out of your GPU. So, I'm going to get to that, and we'll continue from there. Okay, the final example I have here is Far Cry 3. It's an older game, but it still can be pretty demanding. For video settings, I'm actually going to turn this down to 2. Needed it 2 for the moment. But full screen, VSync off, letterbox off, everything else turned all the way up as far as it'll go. I think there was some... Yes, please. Video quality, make sure to show you all these. Oh, this thing's weird. Oh, please. It wants to fight me. There we go. Textures, high, high, ultra, ultra. You can see everything's turned up. Anyway, let's get into the game. So, I'm getting about 80 to 90 frames a second. Now, GPU usage is standing at the mid-80s, mid to low 80s, really. And the CPU is only pegged on one core. The Core 3 seems to be at 100%. So there might be a bottleneck happening here. The GPU is not being fully utilized. I mean, the game is running absolutely beautifully. There's no complaint from me whatsoever about how this is... I think I died. No complaint whatsoever about how that's running. But as you can see from that CPU 3 once this decides to load, it was getting pegged at 100%. CPU 4 is at 82, so there might be a bit of a bottleneck. However, there might be something we can do about that. If I go back in the menu here, and I go to my options, and I go to my video, let's turn that anti-aliasing up to 4. Hit apply. Yes. Let's get back in the game. Suddenly, now I'm getting roughly the same frames per second, but GPU use is now at 98, 95%. Same CPU results, 100% on Core 3, high 80s on Core 4, not much else going on. So what does that say to me? It says that there was a bottleneck happening here, but it wasn't so harsh a bottleneck that we couldn't overcome it just by turning up the settings. Now if I turn on 8x anti-aliasing, my frame rate will tank, but you guys just saw I went from 2 to 4 without any problem whatsoever, and it's running virtually the same. I might have lost a few frames, but at least now the GPU is being fully utilized at its full 2000 to 2012 megahertz clock, and I got a benefit from it. I got greater image quality. So if anyone tells you, because you have a Core i5 or a hyper-threaded Core i3, that you can't utilize a GTX 1080, I say that they're full of crap. Will you run into instances where the CPU is bottlenecking the GPU? If you play games with lots of NPCs or games that are very CPU reliant, such as The Witcher 3 or Grand Theft Auto 5, then yes, you will run into those situations, but there are ways to mitigate them, and there are ways to extract the performance out of your GPU. Furthermore, there are plenty of games that aren't heavy on the CPU that will absolutely take advantage of that GPU. So I recommend that even if you have like a hyper-threaded i3, I think that you'd be able to see some extra performance out of a 1080 over a 1070. That said, would a better CPU be a good idea? Probably, but, you know, if you're focused more on the graphics, then more power to you. So, there's the case I wanted to make. I don't know if you're convinced. Let me know in the comments. Alright, so as you saw there, it is pretty evident that if you have an i5 processor like I do, and even like if it's an older one, like an i5 25 series, or even older than that, you probably will not bottleneck your 1080 in many circumstances. Could you do with an upgrade? Possibly, but it's not that big a deal. That said, if you want to get a 1080 and you're just looking for graphical horsepower and you have a weaker processor, I don't think you should hold back. Because even if you don't have the processor for it, in the future you might, and when you upgrade, that's one less component that you have to buy then. But it is worth noting that it can bottleneck in some games. Let me know what you think in the comments, or if you'd like to see any other content like this, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!